If you ever wanted to get into C# for Unity and you're not a programmer, then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Stickley, a Unity 3D developer interested in making interactive experiences that push the boundaries between fine art and game engine rendering. Today, our focus is C# for non-programmers, specifically creative folks. Before we begin our conversation, I would like to thank my good friends at VR for sponsoring this episode. Thanks to their support, I'm able to continue to create great content to share with you. VR allows you to easily share your 360-degree photos and videos with the entire world. Plus, they now have a VR experience that lets you build 360-degree tours easily. You can access VR through the web, mobile, and all major VR platforms. You can check them out at howtocreatevr.com/VRVR. Make sure you use this URL so that they know I sent you there. All right, Ethan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. You work for Sunny Boy Entertainment, and I had an office visit over there, right? Met you, and you showed me the cool stuff you were working with. Thank you for coming on my podcast and talking all about how to code in C#, especially if you're not a programmer.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
So why don't we start out with you giving us a bit about your background? How did you get into VR, and how did you go from being a designer to coding?
Okay, so originally I come more from a creative background, and so I was a musician by trade originally. I started going to school as a math major, which is where I was first introduced to coding through a C++ course. I think at the time I was in school, it didn't really click how much you could do creatively with the coding side, and so it was more just memorization and getting used to a process. But it was later, a few years later, I was interested in learning how to create my own custom MIDI boards using Arduino microprocessors. And so what those would let me do is take outside analog sensors to convert their movements over into MIDI signals so I could control interactive video galleries. And that was the first place stepping into Arduino where it really made sense. Oh, if I know how to code, I can do almost anything. It's just a matter of learning how to tell the machine what to do. I spent a while on cat-like coding and Khan Academy going through learning some of the basic languages like JavaScript. From there, though, Unity jumped out at me as not only could I make these interactive video galleries, I can make full worlds that people can step into and explore. At that point, I still didn't have my eye on VR. I was approached by Sunny Boy to come in and help them guide their creative towards what would work in a 3D environment and in VR. And from there, that really pushed me to understand the limits and the boundaries of it. And it really took off, and I have just been enjoying my time in it so far.
So you quickly realized that to push the boundaries of VR, you can't just know Unity, you have to also know C#, which is the code behind it, right?
Yeah, they go hand in hand. So what's nice about Unity is you can step into it with no knowledge of coding and just use pre-created assets and scripts to achieve things that you want. The moment you want to start customizing and creating unique effects, then you suddenly have to be able to jump into the code and start dissecting it and picking apart to get the effect that you're looking for.
So before we jump into the details of C#, what's your favorite VR experience as of today and why?
I think right now it's duck season. I don't know if you've played that boat.
I have not played it yet. I've heard of it and I haven't played it. I've been occupying my time with Red Matter lately, which I'm highly enjoying.
I haven't played that one yet.
It's pretty good. And of course, Beat Saber, which, who hasn't played that one yet?
Beat Saber's great. Super Hot was the first one that really jumped out at me.
Super Hot is still the classic VR experience. It's the Matrix, man. I love it.
It's funny because before I ever tried VR, all I would see was videos online of people on a roller coaster and falling over in their chair. And it was always so weird to me. How does someone actually fall over? How do they get so into it? And Super Hot was the first experience where I tried leaning into a wall and just fully fell over because it took over, and I just accepted that I was in that environment.
That is so funny because since you played Super Hot, and we're going to get back on track, guys. Everybody listening in, I'm sorry, but we're doing a little game talk here. But in Super Hot VR, there's this ledge where you got the guns way at the bottom underneath the ledge. I went down to pick up the guns, and of course, to get up, I put my hands on top of the ledge, which doesn't exist in real life. I fell over. It was hilarious. So I totally understand you.
I think the reason why Duck Season is taking my top right now is it's this perfect blend of a short form game, but because it has so many alternate endings, you just want to keep back and playing it and see the story unfold in different ways. Where Super Hot is really engaging, really fun, but it's kind of one experience and it's not so story driven. It's more just the play mechanics. Duck Season just puts you in this really engaging environment. It's very creepy, and you slowly just start to watch your world descend into madness. And something about that's just really fun. It felt like the first long-form VR game that I played that really made sense.
Yep, definitely. I'll have to check it out. But let's get back on focus here, which is what people came here for, which is C#, right? So getting back into C#, you said you quickly found out that, there are limits to what you can do with design only, and you thought basically coding was just telling a machine what to do, not very creative. But as I'm sure you're aware now, you can be extremely creative as a programmer, right?
Yeah, it's all. I like to compare working in Unity to playing The Sims, but to the infinite degree, to where you can make, create, and customize almost anything to your heart's desire.
Right. So how important is knowing C# for a designer listening right now and wanting to push the boundaries? How important is knowing C# so they can continue that trajectory?
I think it's pretty important, but I think it works on a sliding scale, kind of similar to learning a language, where you can jump into it and start creating things that are really interesting with no knowledge or just with a very few basic building blocks. But the more that you learn, the more doors open up. The more you learn, the more gateways open up, and the more potential you have to really get what you have in your mind versus stumbling across something that looks interesting.
That's a great analogy, learning a language, right? Because, like, for example, we're going to be going to Europe at the end of the year, and I'm just learning how to ask for the basics in French, right? But if I want to write a book in French, obviously I have to know a lot more than the simple stuff. So I like how you compare that to, look, you can jump in and learn some of the quick things to do, right? Like grabbing something in VR or tossing it or whatever that may be. But if you really want to take it to the next level, you're going to have to learn some of that core.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about C# a little bit, being object-oriented language. Do you have to know anything about OO programming to understand C# in Unity?
I think the more that you know, the more it helps. But I think the way it works within Unity is a good tool for learning and understanding object-oriented languages, to where, for me, I'm a very visual person. So being in the editor, having separate game objects in the hierarchy that all have instances of the same script, that script then only applies to the game object it is set on. But if you go into the actual script itself in the editor and make a change, it equally applies across everybody. So I think the way Unity is built is a really good visual understanding for how object-oriented scripting works as a fundamental. You don't have to know it going into it immediately, but it's something you'll very quickly be faced with and start to learn more.
And speaking of visual, Unreal, which uses C++, has a sort of a visual layer of that C++ called Blueprint, right? That you could use to build scripts visually, literally dragging and dropping boxes and attaching them together to create logic. Does Unity have anything similar to that for C#?
Right out of the box, default, it doesn't that I know of, but I know there's a number of third-party assets that people have created that allow you to do that. I know there's things like Bolt and Flow Canvas that they're not free, they're paid assets, but if that's something that really enables you to, if you don't feel comfortable on the coding side and you want to bypass that and take it from a visual approach, there are ways to do it in Unity, just not right out of the box.
Have you used any of those, or did you basically jump into the code?
I jumped into the code. It wasn't only until later that I found out about things like Bolt and Flow Canvas, but even still, I haven't dove into them.
So how do you go about finding pre-made libraries? And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. There are basic things that it doesn't matter what your VR application is going to do. Teleporting is a basic thing. You got to move around. Grabbing something is a basic thing. Do you have to code those interactions every single time, or are there pre-made libraries you can use that helps you jumpstart that?
There are a lot of pre-made libraries that you can use, and it kind of depends on how you want to limit the final deployment of the product. If you're planning on only supporting Vive and Oculus Rift, if you're planning on only supporting Vive and Oculus Rift, you can jump straight into the Steam VR SDK, which is really nice because it contains different examples of their interaction mechanics, hovering, throwing, teleporting. Another one that's really useful is VRTK. And my understanding right now is that it's an open source project, but the actual creators have stepped away from it. So I don't know if it's going to continue to be updated. But I know what's nice about VRTK is they keep the different SDKs isolated from the interaction mechanics. So if you're trying to work with Windows Mixed Reality or the Oculus SDK or the Steam VR SDK, those all can plug directly into it without having to rewrite your different interaction mechanics. Whereas using the Steam VR SDK will, out of the box, only allow you to support Rift and HTC Vive. But I think the best part about Unity is how active the forums and the community is around it. So for me, a lot of the starting point is just Googling a specific thing that I'm trying to create and not trying to reinvent the wheel, but there's almost inevitably someone who has a tutorial or a YouTube video based on creating the one effect that I'm looking for. And then from there, I can start to modify their code base.
Right. Now that makes a lot of sense. So as a beginner, or when you were first starting out with C#, how did you figure out how to optimize it? Because part of coding, right, is not just writing code, but it's also optimizing the code so it runs fast and the experience is a good experience. Do you have any tips that you can recommend to new people starting out as to what to look out for?
I think one of the biggest things is to minimize what you're doing in your update loops. I feel like that's the easiest thing to go wrong, where you'll pack a lot of stuff that's checking and different checks and rules that are going on in your update loop, but those are getting checked every single frame. And there's usually a lot of things that you can strip out of that then will get called if something is triggered. But I think minimizing what you're doing in an update loop, I think for loops as well will continue to run until that loop is finished. So sometimes if you have a really large operation, that will slow down each frame. But I think that's the area where there's a lot of great guides online if you literally just search optimizing your C# code for Unity. I think the best part is that none of it is very archaic or hard to understand. It's just a lot of checkboxes that you have to go through and just make sure you're doing certain things correctly or not doing them.
Right. So how do you test your code? Because that's got to be part of the big portion of your daily job also, is not just writing this code, but then testing it to make sure it works in your HTC Vive and testing to make sure it works in Rift and maybe in the Oculus Go and, a billion others.
Yeah, a lot of it is just brute force testing, writing the code, going back into Unity. They talk a lot about iterative design, so they try to make it really quick between writing the code to being able to actually test it on a device. Luckily, when you're working on Rift and Vive, you don't have to build the project, deploy it to do a single test. You can press play within the editor and then start running through. I think the hardest thing is when it seems to work, but then you encounter some weird edge case scenario where you're suddenly having issues and you have to jump back into the code. But for me, it's just that that iterative back and forth between writing the script, it compiles it into Unity. That's my first test, if it actually compiled correctly and Unity can run. And then once it's running, just trying it as much as I can. For me, the best thing is handing it off to different coworkers who aren't as experienced with VR. And I'll find there's a lot of assumptions that I make along the way of, well, people will always grab it this way, or people will always approach this obstacle this way. By handing it over to coworkers or different outside testers and seeing what they run into, they almost inevitably always find something that I wasn't planning for, and then it's back to the drawing boards.
Of course, the users will always find what you did wrong.
Yeah.
So how long did it take you to consider yourself pretty comfortable with C#?
I think it's an ongoing process. I'm still learning things every day. I think there was a noticeable point where I think about a year in or 2 years in, it started really clicking to where I didn't have to Google every single line of code that I wanted to create. But it's like, oh, okay, I remember how to create this process or how to reference my Vive controllers to get their input. But still, every day, I think at least half of what I'm doing is Googling questions and trying to see how people approach different problems. So I think it's an ongoing learning process.
Well, you mentioned Google. What other resources do you recommend for people to learn C#, specifically as it pertains to Unity and VR?
I think a great one, this maybe has less to do with VR, but Catlight Coding has a lot of great lessons on there. It's geared towards Unity, it's in C#, but it's these really beautiful different examples they've created for complex noise functions or deformable meshes. Those all translate directly into Unity and will give you a lot of options visually for what you can create. I think as far as VR, the forums have been the most helpful thing for me. The forums and YouTube, it seems like almost any question I've had, there's been someone out there who's answered it. The newer the equipment or the newer the version of Unity or the newer the asset, the harder it is to find people who have answered the same questions that you're looking for. But I think the forums are the most invaluable resource out there.
What about math? How much math do you need to know to code in C#? I guess it's not really to code in C#, but really how much math do you need to know to do what you want for your game, right? Because gaming uses a lot of vector math.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the biggest thing. Getting used to the idea of just what is a vector, how does that apply to describing an object's position in space, its rotation. I think the hardest thing for me is working with Euler angles versus quaternions, and I still feel like at least once a week, am hitting an issue where, man, I just can't get this thing to rotate the way I'm expecting it to rotate, and trying to understand the difference between this 4-value quaternion and this 3-value vector Euler angle. So I think having at least a basic knowledge of vector math is really helpful. Though at the same time, I think most things that you're trying to accomplish, if you don't know it, you can find someone online who can explain it or how to achieve something similar.
Now, Unity supports, or as far as I'm aware of, supports both C# and JavaScript. Why would you as a designer pick, let's say, C# over JavaScript?
I think when I was first starting a few years ago, it was a little more up to choice. If you were more familiar with JavaScript, I keep hearing that the JavaScript in Unity is not truly JavaScript, it's Unity script, though I don't know enough to say what the difference is in that. But it seems like as of the newest versions of Unity, they're starting to drop support for JavaScript. Whereas when I first started, it was a little more up to choice. I think now the better investment is to be learning C#. And it also seems like the majority of tutorials or examples or documentation you see all are centered on C# versus JavaScript.
I see. So it's no longer really a choice. It's pretty much C# or nothing.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
That makes sense.
I think even the older assets on the asset store that were written for JavaScript are starting to be deprecated unless they update it to C#.
I see. So if you're in a Mac or Windows, does Unity with C# work the same, or do you have to do certain things on Mac versus Windows?
To my knowledge, it works the same. with Unity out the box, it'll give you Mono Develop, which works on both. On a PC, we'll end up using Visual Studio, and on my Mac, I end up using Sublime Text for my editing. But as far as Unity and C#, it should function identically on both.
Do you do any other kind of coding outside of VR? So the core question I'm asking here is the investment in C#, has it helped you, for example, in doing mobile apps or anything of that sort?
Not so much. Professionally, what I've been focused on is VR. The mobile apps that I'm doing are also mobile VR for Daydream or Gear VR or Cardboard. So while I would like to say that, yes, I am diligently outside of work, have some other amazing coding project going on, no, for the most part, all of my stuff has either been focused on VR or at least 3D graphics within Unity.
The nice thing, though, is if you do move on to other things that use C#, pretty much the language is the language, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much out of the time. I do want to thank you for being here. But before I let you go, I like to ask all of my guests one question, which is, what would you like VR to be like 5 years from now? And this is if you had full control over the world. Well, I don't want to give you full control of the world because I don't know you that well. Maybe you'll be one of those bad guys. No, I don't think you would be, actually. So I'll give you full control. What would VR be like?
I think my answer comes back to the practicality of it. What I would really like to see in 5 years is more comfortable headsets that are cheaper to purchase. So there's a larger market penetration, which then encourages studios to make more full VR experiences, more fully thought out AAA games, which then will bring in even more people to play them. I think the most exciting for me in VR is the networked experiences where, like Rec Room, where you can just hear people talking, you can interact directly with them, like VR chat. So to see that explode into more, I just want more people to use it. And I want to be able to play it with all of my friends. I want it to be cheaper. And I want the disparity between mobile VR and standalone VR to start to diminish. And what I mean is the standalone having the 6 degrees of freedom. You can fully move around. You have 2-track controllers versus the more easily purchased, but the more constrained 3-DOF single controller mobile VR that is fun, but I feel doesn't fully convey the sense of presence that you have in the standalone headsets like Vive and Rift. So what I would hope in the next 5 years is that disparity starts to shrink, more people start to purchase it, and larger studios feel comfortable pumping more money into it to create larger, more in-depth experiences similar to console games.
Well, part of that wish may come true actually first quarter of next year, supposedly the rumor with Oculus Santa Cruz, right? Because Oculus Santa Cruz is pretty much going to be like a Rift, not as powerful, but 6 degrees of freedom. I think it's going to have 2 controllers and completely wireless.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to trying it.
Yeah. Are you going to go to the Oculus Connect?
No, I'm not. I wish I could.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll be there. I'll tell you all about it later.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Hopefully they have Santa Cruz there so we can try it out. I'm really looking forward to that. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think if all goes well with that, that's going to be the first major step towards that. So I'm excited.
Well, Ethan, I really appreciate your time here. Thank you so much. If people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give email, Twitter, whatever you like?
If anyone's looking to get a hold of me or looking for any help as far as development services, they could go to my website, hightechlowstress.com. That's HIGHTECH lowstress.com. We're available to answer any questions or to help people with development projects. Looking forward to hearing from you.
I love that website name, High Tech Low Stress. Love it.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Ethan. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you'd like to watch video interviews and how-to tutorials all about immersive technologies, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at howtocreatevr.com/YouTube. If you're ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR and AR presentations. You can join our RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.